Good morning, Living Hope Fellowship, and anyone else who is watching this video. I say good morning. I don't know when you're watching this. I'm recording it for Sunday morning, May 17th, for Living Hope Fellowship, a church in Greenwood, Delaware that I'm privileged to be a pastor of. But I welcome you from wherever and whenever you're watching this video. We are now on the 10th Sunday where we cannot meet due to the coronavirus pandemic. Hopefully, here in Delaware, we're starting to see an end to this, a light at the end of the tunnel. I know many states are able to start meeting in some way as churches, and hopefully that's going to be the case for us next month. We met as a council last week and began to talk about what that might look like, meeting in smaller groups, doing certain things to make sure we're meeting in a safe way and following the guidelines that we will need to follow. But for today, we meet again like this, and we're going to be looking at a psalm. And actually, we're going to be looking at two psalms, Psalm 42 and 43. In our Bible, we have this as two separate psalms, but most commentators believe that originally these were one psalm. And somewhere along the line, they were divided up into two for whatever reason, we're not sure. But as we read it, I'm sure you'll hear why most think that this is one psalm. For one thing, there's a common theme that runs from verse 1 of 42 to the end of verse 43. But not only is there a common theme, but there's a repeated common refrain. In verses 5 and 11, you have the exact same refrain in Psalm 42. But then in verse 5 of Psalm 43, you have this same refrain repeated. Most likely this was a psalm that was all read together, and it has three verses, a verse and then a chorus, a verse and then that same chorus, and then another verse and that same chorus again. As we read, you'll notice that this psalm is not a happy psalm, but instead it's a song. That's what psalms are. It's a song that is set in a minor key. It's a psalm of laments. And actually, it's part of the largest category of psalms that we have. If we're dividing psalms into different categories by genre or type, we have psalms of thanksgiving, we have psalms of praise, we have psalms that were royal psalms that were that were used in the coronation of a king or used to celebrate a king of Israel. But the largest category, and really the largest category by far of psalms that make up the book of Psalms, is the category of lament. One Bible dictionary I had defined lament as a song of sorrow or a song of mourning. Just think about that for a second. In the Bible's songbook, which that's what Psalms is, it's the Bible's songs. It's the poems and songs that were used by the people of Israel in their worship, both individually and gathered together. And the longest category of songs are songs of sorrow. And I find great encouragement in that. First of all, I find encouragement because it means that we are free to have sorrow and we're free to mourn. So free, in fact, that God gives us words to use in our sorrow and in our mourning. We can use these words from these psalms of lament. But I also find encouragement that because it invites us to come to God in our sorrow and in our mourning. You know, one commentator I read said it's very encouraging to be able to know that we can come before God and answer truthfully the question, how are we? But by saying, well, right now life actually really stinks. You know, we ask each other that question often, how are you? And often we just give the quick response, I'm good, how are you? But often we're not really being truthful in that. And the Psalms of Lament remind us that we can be honest with God when we come to him. When he asks us the question, how are you? We can be honest and say, God, right now, life is hard. Right now, God, life stinks. Right now, God, actually, I'm pretty miserable. The Psalms of Lament remind us of that. But often we don't like Psalms of Lament. We don't know what to do with Psalms of Lament. And in our gatherings together, when we choose songs to sing and songs that make up our songbook, we don't include many songs of lament. We want happy, upbeat songs. We want songs of praise. We want songs reminding us of the good things. But not only in our gatherings, but individually, we don't like to lament. We don't want to be able to express our sorrow, but instead we want to find something that will help us to fix it and to fix whatever is causing our sorrow. Or we want something that will help us to forget about it and drown out our sorrow. But to lament means that we come to a place where we realize that we cannot fix the problem that we're in. Neither can we ignore it. All we can do is come and lay it before God. The attitude of lament is found in the expression at the end of 2 Chronicles 20:12, where they say, we don't know what to do, God, but our eyes are upon you. God, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are upon you. That is the attitude of lament. Lament says, God, I do not know what to do. So I'm just going to come and I'm going to fix my eyes on you. Well, this is where the psalmist of Psalm 42 and 43 has landed. He doesn't know what to do about the situation that he is in, and he is fighting in this psalm to keep his eyes on God. So let me read these two psalms and then we will unpack them together. Psalm 42 and 43. And I read from the ESV Bible, but I encourage you, open your Bibles, whatever translation you have, and just follow along with me. Verse 1. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul. How I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise. A multitude keeping festival. Why are you downcast? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you. From the land of Jordan and of Hermon from Mount Mizar, deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day, the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night, his song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Vindicate me, O God, and defend my cause against an ungodly people. From the deceitful and unjust man, deliver me. For you are the God in whom I take refuge. Why have you rejected me? Why do I go about mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? Send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy. And I will praise you with the lyre, O God, my God. Why are you downcast, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. So what is the reason for this psalmist's lament? What has brought about this lament, this feeling of hopelessness and sorrow for him? We find it when we combine the end of verse 4 and the end of verse 6. Reading now from the NIV, verse 4 says, I used to go to the house of God under the protection of the Mighty One, with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throng. But now, he says in verse 6, I remember you from the land of the Jordan, from the heights of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. The reason for this, for this lament, for this son of Korah, and that's who wrote this song. If you see the postscript or the prescript, the title, Sons of Korah were the worship leaders in the temple, and this son of Korah, he used to lead the glad procession into the temple in Jerusalem, but now, and this is what has brought about his lament, now he is unable to, because he is in the land of Jordan near the heights of Hermon, which this is an area far north of Jerusalem. The reason for his lament is that he cannot gather in the house of God with the people of God to worship God. Can you relate to that lament? Is there anyone right now who can relate to that lament? A lament of not being able to gather in the house of God with the people of God to worship God. And I'm recording in a women's Sunday school classroom here at the church, so I know that we can relate to this lament. In fact, to make it even perhaps more relatable, one commentator said that the reason for this could be due to an illness. A commentator by the name of James Waltner says, unable to return to the temple because of illness or political reasons, the song reflects the dark night of the soul of one homesick for God's house. It reflects the dark night of the soul for one who is homesick for God's house. You ever find a passage of Scripture, one you've read many times, perhaps, but you read it now in the circumstances that you are in this moment, and you feel as though this verse or this passage has been written for you and kept for you so that you would read in this moment. And I read that comment from Waltner, and I thought, wow, what an incredible grace that we have these Psalms kept for us to read in this moment. It's a reminder to us that we are not the first to experience what we are experiencing. But it's also a reminder to us that God sees us in the midst of what we are experiencing. And he wants us to know that he sees us. So he has given us Psalm 42 and Psalm 43. Speaking to those who are homesick for God's house. And you notice as we read this psalm, the psalmist is talking to himself. He's speaking to himself. I don't know if you've ever done that before. You talk to yourself. Now, a lot of us listen to ourselves. But how many of us actually take the time to talk to ourselves? Take the time to tell ourselves what we should be feeling and what we should be thinking. And that's what the psalmist is doing. He's telling himself, hope in God. Hope in God. In the midst of the turmoil that you are experiencing, in the midst of the feeling of being cast down and cast out, hope in God. And as he talks to himself throughout this psalm, you may notice that despite his circumstances not changing, his attitude in the midst of those circumstances does change. If we were playing this song as a worship team, there would be a constant crescendo throughout this entire song, a constant building. And the clue to this is found in how the psalmist refers to God throughout the psalm. Notice in the first verse of the song, the verses leading up to that first time we hear the refrain, he describes God as my soul thirsts for God. And here's how he describes God: for the living God. Now, that's not wrong. That's true and that's good. God is the living God, and it's good for us to remember that in our lament. He's not a dead God, but he is a living God. He's not a lifeless God, but he is a God who is alive. But notice what he says in the second part of the psalm. In verse 8, he says, the God of my life. The God of my life. Do you hear the difference there? Not only is he the living God, but he is the God of this one who is living. He is the God of me. He's the God of my life. But then notice in the final stanza of this song how he describes God. He says he's singing this and praying this to God, my exceeding joy, O God, my God. The God of my exceeding joy. The NIV says, the God who is my delight. The New Living Translation says, the God who is the source of my delight, the source of my joy. Do you hear the crescendo that takes place throughout this psalm? Again, if the worship team were playing this as a song, the first time we would sing the chorus, it would be quiet and almost mournful. A few instruments, but mainly just the vocals singing lightly that chorus, hope in God. But then as we arrive at the chorus the second time, a few instruments would have been added and a few voices, and the voices singing a little stronger. But by the third refrain, the whole band would be in, and the vocals would be soaring in praise to God. But, and this is important, nothing has changed about the circumstances of this psalmist. He is still far from Jerusalem in Psalm 43. He is still missing the worship in the temple. His situation has not been fixed. But although his circumstances have not changed, he has changed, and his perspective has changed. So what has brought about this change of perspective, and what can bring about our change of perspective as we ourselves are homesick for the house of God? We'll answer that question by going through these Psalms, one stanza at a time. And in the first stanza, in verses 1 through 5 of Psalm 42, we see that the psalmist begins with a longing for God. A longing for God. In verses 1 and 2, he compares himself to a deer who is panting for water, panting for flowing streams. In the metrical version of this psalm, which is just a version that rewords it so that it is singable in the English. And in that version of the psalm, it's written as though the deer is panting because he is tired after being chased. As pants the hart, which the hart is a male deer, as pants the hart for cooling streams when heated in the chase. You can hear it in a rhythm that it can be sung. But in the original psalm, in the psalm in our Bibles, it appears not as though the deer is panting because he's worn out and tired from being chased or tired from running, but instead his thirst is brought about from a drought. His thirst is not due to exertion, but his thirst is due to deprivation. He is in a spiritual drought. He is looking for water. He is longing for water, but he is not finding water. Instead, what he does find are his tears. Instead of finding the refreshing water of a stream to drink from, he instead finds the salty, bitter waters of his tears. Verse 3 says, "My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God?" He has been feeding and feasting off of his grief. All he has to eat and drink are his tears. And notice the two questions of verse 2 and 3. In verse 2, the question of when. And in verse 3, the question of where. When shall I appear before God? In verse 3, where is God? Both of these are open-ended questions. He doesn't have an answer to those questions. And that unanswered question leaves him upset and frustrated and in turmoil. He can't understand what's going on, nor does he understand why it's going on. And to try to find solace, to try to find comfort, he says in verse 4 that he remembers. He looks at a time when the when and the where questions were not present. He looks back and he says, I remember when I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. And you can resonate with that longing, just the word multitude. I long to be in a multitude again. And particularly a multitude of people shouting and giving praise to God. And the psalmist longs for that, and he looks back to a day when that was possible. But the memories of those days only increase his longing. Like the thought of water when you're thirsty only intensifies your thirst. The thought of how things used to be only increases his anguish. Two things to notice about this first stanza before we move on. First, notice the importance he places on corporate worship. In verses 1 and 2, he refers to things that are essential to physical life. He refers to panting, the panting of the deer, which reminds us of air and the need to breathe. He refers to water, thirsting for a stream. He refers to food. His tears have been his food, and he's hungry for real food. Air, water, and food, essentials to physical life. Without them, we cannot survive. And then he says, that's what gathered worship is to my spiritual life. I need it. I cannot survive without it. One commentator pointed out that while this psalm, when it was written written by an individual, and it was an individual lament, because it's in the Psalter, we know that it would have been used in a corporate setting. It would have been said or sang together in the temple or in the synagogue. Well, how would this have applied to them when they are together and they are in the temple? They're not far off. The ESV Study Bible says this. It says, singing this in corporate worship would especially foster a sense of yearning and expectation in the faithful, so that they would learn to attend worship looking for God's presence, to mourn any circumstances that prevent them from attendance, and to count their attendance at worship as a great gift from God, certainly not a burdensome duty. You know, one of the things that I am hoping comes out of this pandemic is that we never again take for granted the importance and the blessing of gathered worship. That we come out of this understanding how vital it is for our spiritual health. That we would see the admonition of Hebrews chapter 10 of not forsaking the gathering together of believers, not as a burden, but as a joyful reminder of what brings health to our spiritual lives. That we would never again simply not go to church because we don't want to, or we have something else that we could be doing, but we would see that we need to be at church and we need to be together with God's people, worshiping God together. That's the first thing we notice of this first stanza, the need for gathered worship, but also notice that we see here the purpose of gathered worship, the goal of gathered worship. Yes, the psalmist longs to be in the temple. Yes, he longs to be with the multitude and lead the procession of God's people into the temple. But his longing is not ultimately for a place or for a crowd, but it is for an individual. And that individual is God. His longing is for God. My soul, he says, thirsts for God. And this, I hope, is our longing. It's not just to have something to do on Sunday morning. It's not just for me to be able to play with the worship team or to be able to preach to you and not to a camera, or to gather and have our coffee together and sit in our Sunday school rooms, as important as all of those things are. But that we would see that all of those things are meant to point us to the deeper longing and the only thing that can truly satisfy us about being together as a church, and that is that it brings us to God. That God meets us in a special way when we meet together as a gathered body of believers. And in this psalm, we notice the tension that we are all feeling right now. And the tension is this, that while we know it is true that God does not dwell in a place, he does not dwell in a building, in a church, for back then it was the temple. While we know that he is everywhere. And though we know that he does not simply come to visit us on an hour on a Sunday morning during the gathered worship of his people, and we know that he's always with us. While we know those things, at the same time, we know that there is something special about the way God meets us when we gather together with his people as his church. While we know that we are not far from God because he is everywhere and he has promised never to leave us or forsake us, and we know that and we celebrate that, at the same time there is a sense that we feel separated from him because we are separated from his people. This is a paradox we should be experiencing right now. We celebrate the fact that God is with us right now. As you are sitting in your living room watching this on a phone or a computer or a TV, you know that God is with you. But at the same time, there is an emptiness. There is a lacking that you are feeling because you are not sitting here surrounded by God's people, hearing them praise God around you. There's this tension in this psalm, and there's this tension that we are feeling. And this psalm reminds us that that tension is right, and we should feel it. We should long to be reunited with God's people. And as the first verse ends and the first refrain sounds, it sounds very weakly. Its truth is known, but its truth is not felt. Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. We move from the verse 1 of this song to verse 2, and as we do, we move from a longing for God to a looking to God. A longing for God, now we look to God in verses 6 through 11. In verse 6, my psalmist says, my soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you. And before we go on, let's just stop and notice how unexpected that second part is. What would you expect to follow the therefore? Because my soul is cast down within me, what would you expect our reaction to be? And what often is our reaction? My soul is cast down within me, therefore I throw a pity party. My soul is cast down within me, therefore I give up. I quit. My soul is cast down within me, therefore I eat a big bowl of ice cream. And that's what we're tempted to do. That's what we are naturally inclined to do. But notice what the psalmist does and what he invites us to do and calls us to do, and he tells himself to do. He says, therefore, when my soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you. I look to you. But as we read on, we notice that not only does he remember God, but he remembers where he is remembering God from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. The land of Jordan probably refers to where the Jordan River began, which is north of the Sea of Galilee. Hermon refers to Mount Hermon, which is in that same area. But Mount Mizar, we're not sure of where that is. We don't have a geographical place labeled on our maps as Mount Mizar. Mizar in Hebrew means small. So some think that Mizar could have been a smaller mountain within the mountain range surrounding Mount Hermon. Or it could be simply referring to the fact that Mount Hermon is a small mountain in comparison to Mount Zion, where Jerusalem is. Small both in size, but also and particularly in significance. Mount Hermon does not compare to Mount Zion, where the temple of God is. And he says, I remember you, but I remember you from here. And here we are right now. We're worshiping God, we're remembering God, we're looking to God, but then we look around us and we say, yeah, but I'm looking to you from here. And this is small in comparison. And with my eyes, it's small in comparison to where I long to be. I remember you from a place far from Jerusalem, the psalmist says. And just like in the first stanza, the theme of water shows up. Then now we go from a drought to a flood. And the psalmist goes from being dry to drowning. Verse 7, deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. And we might look at that and say, well, I kind of like to sit and look at a waterfall and bask in the glory and majesty of a waterfall. That's not what's happening here. He's not basking in the waterfall, but he is getting slammed beneath the waterfall. The waterfall is on top of him. He is getting poured down upon him. In fact, the language is the same language that Jonah uses when he is thrown overboard. Jonah 2 verse 3, "For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounds me. All your waves and all your billows pass over me." The psalmist says, God, I'm drowning here. And notice what he says. He says, I'm drowning under your waterfalls. And I'm drowning under your waves and your billows. The psalmist recognizes that the waves of turmoil that are overwhelming him are not a rogue, uncontrollable force, but that they are under the sovereign control of God. Why is that important for him to remember? Why is that important for us to remember? That all of this is under God's sovereign control. Well, here's why. Because it's only if God is sovereign over the waves that he can be sovereign over the one who is under the waves. It's only if God is sovereign over the waves that he can be sovereign to those who are under the waves. It's only because God is sovereign over the waves in verse 7 that he is sovereign in verse 8 and commands his steadfast love to come to the one who is being overwhelmed by the waves. John Piper wrote a little book in response to the current pandemic that we are in called Coronavirus and Christ. And in it he writes this. He says, "Why should I receive the news of God's sovereignty over the coronavirus and sovereignty over my life as a sweet teaching?" And that's one of the questions we might ask as we try to wrestle with God's sovereignty and suffering and evil that is in this world and that we are experiencing. Often we just want to get rid of God's sovereignty. And he says, don't do that. In fact, accept this as a sweet teaching. But then he says, why should we? And he says, the secret to this, to knowing this, is this. The secret is knowing that the same sovereignty that could stop the coronavirus, yet doesn't, is the very same sovereignty that sustains the soul in it. In other words, if we try to rescue God from his sovereignty over sufferings, if we try to get rid of that teaching from the scripture that God is sovereign over suffering because we honestly just do not understand it, if we try to rescue God from that, we sacrifice his sovereignty to turn all things for good. If we try to remove the idea of God's sovereignty over suffering and the pain we experience in this world, then we will end up with a God who is unable to reach us in our suffering and not able to keep his promise to turn all things for good. The one who commands the waves is the one who commands his steadfast love to meet us in the waves and gives us songs in the night, even in the darkest night. Let me point out one more thing about this location that the psalmist is in. Remember, he's in the land of Jordan, of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Now that location, as abstract and obscure as it is, that should catch our attention. Particularly for you regulars of Living Hope Fellowship. Because we have recently been to Mount Hermon. Not physically, of course, but in a sermon. We went to Mount Hermon when we were in the book of Mark. When Jesus left the land of Galilee, remember, he left Galilee for a period of time and ministered to other regions. And he did that because of the opposition he was facing among the Jews, particularly the religious leaders. And he went north. He went as far north as Caesarea Philippi, and there at Caesarea Philippi, he went up on a mountain. And there on that mountain outside Caesarea Philippi, he was transfigured. His glory was revealed to his disciples. Well, that mountain of Mark chapter 9, that place where the transfiguration took place, most think is this Mount Hermon. And when I realized that this week, because I looked at that location, I said, why is this catching my attention? And when I realized that, I literally laughed out loud. And I laughed and I clapped my hands, and the building, of course, is empty, and the sound just echoed throughout this empty church building. And my laugh was not a, ha, that's funny laugh. But it was that is an incredible, joy-filled laugh. Do you see the significance of this? The psalmist in Psalm 42 and 43 was forced out of Jerusalem. He could not be with God's people in God's place. He was forced to a lonely and desolate mountain. He was forced to Mount Hermon, a Mizar mountain, a small mountain, an insignificant mountain, and a place that was certainly not Mount Zion. And there he cried out to God, God, I want to be near you. And there he tried to remember as hard as he could and fix his eyes on God's steadfast love that seemed so distant to him. Psalm 42 and 43. Then in the Gospels, we find that Jesus, God, the very God, the Son of God, God himself, was forced out of Jerusalem. The people of God rejected him. He was not welcome in the dwelling place of God, the temple, and he went to a lonely, desolate mountain, Mount Hermon. And it was there that he revealed his glory. And it was there that he said to those sleepy disciples, here I am. I have come to be near to you. And we read on in verses 9 and 10 of Psalm 42. We can almost hear these words. We can almost hear these words coming from another Mizar mountain, another small mountain, a hill called Calvary. We can almost hear these words as if they were words of Jesus, because they're very similar to what he says on the cross. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? You can look to the cross, the account of the cross, and see very similar words. Let God rescue him. Jesus cries out, why have you forsaken me, God? God, my rock, God, my God. When we look to God in the midst of our turmoil, when we look to God in the midst of our being far away from the people of God, when we look to God, we have an even better sight than the psalmist. Because we look to the God who came to our Jordan, to our Mount Hermon. And we have a God who didn't merely command his love to reach us in the waves, but he came and he entered into the waves with us. And the waterfalls of suffering and the waves of sorrow he experienced. In fact, the greatest wave, the wave of God's wrath, he went under so that we never will. And we are reminded of the God who is our life. Throughout this psalm, the psalmist refers to God. In fact, over 21 times, or actually not over, 21 times exactly, he uses the name of God. But 20 of those times, when he uses the name of God, he refers to him as Elohim, or El, which is the proper name for God. And sometimes when we are in the midst of our sorrow, that's kind of how we address God, in a formal, proper way. But here in verse 8, where he cries out to God and says, the God of my life, he uses a different name for God. He does not use Elohim, but he uses Jehovah, which refers to God as the God of the covenant, the faithful God. Worsby says he refers to him as the God who cares for his people and showers his people with loving kindness. He refers to him as the God who gives them promises to claim when they pray. And for us, we know, refers to him as the God who has entered into our suffering. And it's here in verse 8 that this song begins to change. And it's here that the tide begins to turn and the crescendo takes it up a notch. Because when the psalmist goes from longing for God, who is the living God, to looking to God, who is the God of his life, he then knows that he can trust this God, who is his delight. Longing for God, looking to God, and here's where we want to end up. Right now, where we are, we want to trust this God. And even now, delight in him. Again, verses 1 and 2, I won't put them on the screen. You can read them. Of Psalm 43, show us that his circumstances have not changed. He's still in mourning. He's still in sorrow. He's still being afflicted and mocked. But in verse 3, he turns his sorrow into a prayer. He says this, send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God, my exceeding joy, and I will praise you with the lyre, O God, my God. And then I believe if we could hear the psalmist sing these words, he would no longer be mumbling them, but he would be shouting them from the top of Mount Hermon. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. And we might read those words of verse 3 and 4 and think that he's praising God because he knows that one day he will go back to Jerusalem. He prays and says, God, lead me back to your holy hill, lead me back to your dwelling, and then when I'm back there, I will go to your altar. And that could be. He could be looking ahead to the future, knowing this time will end, and there he says, I can praise you because I know it's coming to an end. And that's a good message for us as we know that this will eventually come to an end. But I think there's something else going on in here. I think more than just looking ahead to a future date, he looks to God and he says, God, you can send your light and your truth to me here now. And here, while I am far off from Jerusalem, while I'm far off from Mount Zion, this place can be a holy hill. This place can be your dwelling. In this place, I can build an altar to you. And here, in the midst of this turmoil, I can praise you. And here I can have hope because your light and your truth and your steadfast love have come to me here. One of the songs that seems like it has come at just the right time because it came out, or at least was made well known right before this pandemic really started taking effect here in our country, is a song called The Blessing. You've probably heard it. Many different versions have been put out, some excellent versions of it. But it's a song that comes right from Numbers chapter 6 and the Aaronic blessing. And I love to use that blessing as a way to close our service, as a benediction, to raise my hands to look at you who are there at Living Hope and seated in the seats there, and to say over you those words, the Lord bless you and the Lord keep you. And these past few weeks, really, especially this past week, I have found great comfort in just sitting and listening to that song. Particularly find the Passion version of it. That's a band, the Passion Band of Louis Giglio's church, and there's an orchestra version of it. And just get alone in a room and blast that song and just allow the words, which again come right from number 6, allow them to just wash over you and you to hear that blessing. And I've been doing that this week, just listening to and being reminded of the fact that the Lord's blessing and the Lord's face being turned upon us can happen even now as we are in this place. But I've also started to do something else just the last few days. And that is to just every day to pray that blessing over you. For those of you who are a part of Living Hope Fellowship, to go into our empty sanctuary. I picked up most of the chairs and stacked them up so it echoes even more in that room than normal. And to just go in that room and to imagine you being there and to pray or to sit down at the piano and sing that version that just came out of those words. And to in some way to sing them and to pray them over you. asking that God would turn his face towards you. And as we close this morning, and I'm going to continue to do that this week and the following weeks, and I can't wait till the time, the first Sunday we're together, and I can look at you and say those words. But today I want to close in just praying that for you, for us. These words of Numbers 6, 24 and 26, that even as we are far off, that they would be true and that we would know them and experience them to be true. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Jesus Christ, my